Hello, and welcome to the President's Class, now solely on YouTube for the pandemic and from my home, where anything can happen. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing series, Seeking Wisdom in Troubled Times. We hope you're safe and well. Mapping fringe ideas is a difficult undertaking. Familiar intellectual landmarks are unavailable, and the inhabitants of these territories tend to speak languages difficult for outsiders to penetrate. Some of these ideas have begun to filter into mainstream popular culture, but their origins lie in obscure and barely visible subcultures, millenarian religion, occultism, and radical politics among them. That is Michael Barkun, and we will come back to him. I did not need further confirmation that the topic of conspiracy is relevant, but I got it anyway. As I write these words, a worker outside my apartment's open window is talking to his colleague. Yeah, and what about COVID 1 through 18? What happened with those first 18 viruses that China developed? At the same time, a friend is sending me a video of Bill Gates speaking to the CIA about developing a respiratory virus in a lab to eradicate Islamic fundamentalism. I watched that Bill Gates video, and I have to say, I was beginning to imagine it being true. I'm a highly educated person and trained especially in evaluating arguments, but it made me watch because I love stories, and conspiracies actually do exist. Finally, I did a fact check and came up with a Reuters article that detailed the issues with the video, showing it to be false and in the service of the anti-vaccination movement. After I sent my friend the fact check, he writes, "I don't know who to believe anymore, but something is up." What a perfect way to put the issue. Something is up, and whom should we believe? My own sensitivity to story overwhelmed my sense of truth until I heard another story that was much less interesting but more factual because it had been tested using conventional methods. Here's perhaps the first insight we can make about conspiracy theories. A good story is more interesting than a bland truth. We saw this in our discussion of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. It was wrong, but it was also a better, that is, a more meaningful story than the right one. But here is another insight. The closer a story is to a truth, the better it is, no matter how dramatic. Matthew's genealogy of Jesus was not that wrong. It was close enough, only 3 names off. Had he included, say, Chinese ancestors in his genealogy of Jesus, it would not have worked at all as a story or as the truth. Finally, we recall that truth is an agreed upon consensus of what is the case, which is constantly changing, but slowly. The etymology of the word means faithfulness to that consensus. Speaking of which, in my news feed at the moment is an article titled "The Kentucky Miner Who Scammed Americans by Claiming He Was Hitler and Plotting a Revolt with Spaceships." The tagline reads, "From 1946 to 1956, many Americans mailed money to a man alleging he was a still-alive Hitler plotting a revolution with invisible spaceships. He signed his letters Furrier #1, not Führer, Furrier." One paragraph is especially descriptive from the article. In hundreds of letters mailed between 1946 and 1956, Furrier #1 explained that he was, despite misspelling his title and writing in vernacular English Adolf Hitler. As it turned out, both he and Eva Braun had survived. They had set up camp in Kentucky to plot a new revolt, then take over the United States and then the world and ultimately outer space. Hitler and his gang of 36,000 German dissidents were hard at work digging tunnels from nearby mountains to Washington, D.C. to aid their revolution. When he wasn't underground, Hitler got around by way of invisible cab. Together, his huge armies of soldiers and scientists had built 116 secret factories across Kentucky and Idaho to develop atomic bombs and invisible spaceships which made no sound. You will probably not be surprised that a 1947 Gallup poll reported that 45% of Americans believed that Hitler was still alive, nor that Furrier number 1 asked for and received what is $140,000 in today's money in donations. What may surprise you, as it did me, was that the writer of this story, Tarpley Hitt, has interviewed me as well. Let the conspiracy theories begin. Most stories live in this truth-lie contested space and are less entertaining than the Furrier number 1 and are more seductive than the Bill Gates one. Many, especially of late, generate violent rhetoric and sometimes violent action. If you want to read a detailed examination of current conspiracy theories, I recommend the Atlantic's Shadowland series. As always, at PRS, we're asking deeper questions, ones that help us get to who we are and how we can be wise in the world. For our purposes, then, the question is the same as my friends. Whom do I believe and why? And something is indeed up. It always is. There are forces and figures always manipulating things outside of our purview and affecting us with their power. Inside that moment of hesitation, in whom to believe lie the seeds of conspiracy theories, and it is time to explore how those seeds are nurtured and cultivated in the nexus of stories failing, stories emerging, truth, and monsters. It would be instructive to walk through the various world and American conspiracy theories, but there are too many, which says something in itself. One thing we would see if we did, though, is that, like monsters, conspiracy theories are pervasive and persistent, but also take on new life in catastrophe. Dramatic change demands an explanation, and there is a sense of betrayal by the old story. So new conspiratorial ones emerge with a vengeance. As we saw with monsters, the catastrophe is more about stories changing than the events themselves, and conspiracies come from the same place as monsters, that chasm of uncertainty that opens in the landscape of culture when a new element breaks in. Let us explore that idea further by looking at a writer whose own catastrophe prompted him to offer one of the first studies of conspiracy theories in American political life. What was the catastrophe that urged historian Richard Hofstadter to write his essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics? It was the nomination of Barry Goldwater as the Republican candidate for president over Nelson Rockefeller in 1964. Goldwater, of course, lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson, but the very fact that such a strange conservative could be nominated by one of the two American political parties was too much to bear for Hofstadter. And like a good scholar, he tried to understand what was happening by combing through history and reaching some conclusions to get at the root cause. Were he alive in 2020, he might be overwhelmed at our current situation. Political scientists tell us, though, that there's a direct line between Goldwater and current conservatives. So Hofstadter was onto something in terms of politics, as well as the theory of conspiracy theories. Published in Harper's Magazine in November of 1964, Hofstadter's essay was based on a lecture given at Oxford University on November 21st, 1963. If that date did not jump out at you, listen again. November 21st, 1963. One day before the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the quintessential conspiracy event in American history. One day before the great writer and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis died in Oxford. One day before another English novelist, Aldous Huxley, mystic and muse for the 1960s, left this world with a lethal dose of LSD administered by his wife at his request. You see how this works? In a short paragraph, I just connected Hofstadter to JFK, C.S. Lewis, and Aldous Huxley. Everything can be connected by chance and language, sometimes too easily so. What today we might call the conspiracy theory mindset, Hofstadter termed the paranoid style in American politics. He meant the phrase to be both psychological and pejorative, but not partisan. Conspiracy theories exist across the political spectrum. He opens the essay by stating, American politics has often been an arena for angry minds. It seems that what shocks him is what is shocking us today. That is, how much political leverage can be got out of the animosities and passions of a small minority. So while he is prompted to write by the Goldwater nomination, he is most concerned with deeper issues that are not confined to political camps. He thereby avoids one of the conspiracy theory traps, which is that evidence marshaled against the theory ends up proving the truth of the theory to those promoting it, especially now when media provides a channel for everyone who has a phone. Conspiracy theories are touted by people of all persuasions throughout history and in all cultural contexts. For example, who can doubt that the New England Patriots get favorable calls by the officials? Who can doubt that Karen in accounting was promoted unfairly over me, and that the parent corporation back east does not care about those of us here on the West Coast? And closer to home, we all know that Osama bin Laden was a follower of Manly P. Hall, right? More on this one later. Conspiracy theories exist in part because they are strange and compelling explanations that are more dramatic than consensus. They are also impenetrable and unfalsifiable, even and especially if evidence is brought to bear against them. As Hofstadter puts it, it is the use of paranoid modes of expression by more or less normal people that make the phenomenon significant. Neither Hofstadter nor I am interested in taking a political position, though politics provides some noteworthy examples of a phenomenon that we all experience and perhaps even participate in. On the contrary, there's something in conspiracy theories to learn about ourselves, our stories, and our interpretation of the world. Hofstadter's primary example of the paranoid mindset centers on the Bavarian Illuminati, and the fact that you are likely aware of the word Illuminati and its connotations speaks to the power of conspiracy stories, even older ones. The bland and true version of the Illuminati is this. Illuminism had been started in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, a professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt. Its teachings today seem to be no more than another version of Enlightenment rationalism, spiced with the anti-clerical atmosphere of 18th century Bavaria. It was a somewhat naive and utopian movement which aspired ultimately to bring the human race under the rules of reason. Its humanitarian rationalism appears to have acquired a fairly wide influence in Masonic lodges. Okay. Illuminism attracts the paranoid style of interpretation for the same reason that other phenomena do, that is, no apparent reason, other than the accidents of history and certain aspirations of assumed insiders and outsiders. The first conspiracy theory about the Illuminati arrives less than 25 years after its birth, with the publication of a book titled Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and reading societies. This was by a Scottish scientist named John Robison, who was himself a casual adherent of Masonry. Hofstadter notes, certain elements of truth and reality there may have been in these views of Masonry. What must be emphasized here, however, is the apocalyptic and absolutistic framework in which this hostility was commonly expressed. This is an important point. There are never conspiracies involving the good, the true, or the beautiful. Playing land safely at LAX does not make for a story worth telling, unless it is my wife returning from a trip. Plane crashes at LAX because of Hillary Clinton's emails is much more dramatic and not too much of an exaggeration. See Pizzagate. So already we can see some outlines of conspiracy stories that make them different from other stories. They aspire to mythic status, but myths are the products of consensus, not conspiracy. Hofstadter's other major example is the anti-Catholic movement in America that worked hand in hand with nativist and racist ideologies and included important and revered figures such as Samuel Morse and Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father. Growing up in the Protestant South, I was exposed to anti-Catholic rhetoric regularly, as one head of a Cerberus whose other two heads were anti-Semitism and racism. Hofstadter quotes a Protestant militant who describes the so-called Catholic threat heatedly and, as is often the case, bizarrely. It is an ascertained fact that Jesuits are prowling about all parts of the United States in every possible disguise, expressly to ascertain the advantageous situations and mode to disseminate popery. A minister of the gospel from Ohio has informed us that he discovered one carrying on his devices in his congregation. And he says that the Western country swarms with them under the name of puppet showmen, dancing masters, music teachers, peddlers of images and ornaments, barrel organ players, and similar practitioners. One wonders if the Ohio minister he cites really just had a deep aversion to certain kinds of entertainment. Puppet showmen are victims of a conspiracy metaphor from the beginning, but barrel organ players? Really? Still, there's a lesson here about this kind of story. And it is that immediate concerns, barrel organ players, get projected into a universal apocalyptic narrative of impending danger and loss of power. The Jesuits are taking over. I will leave it to you to read about Hofstadter's third example if you're interested, which is the contemporary right wing. For him, that was the Goldwater contingent. You will find much that is familiar there, but in a version that looks tame in comparison to contemporary right-wing media and left-wing responses to it. The examples are there to serve a larger point, which is to derive the elements of the paranoid style. And here's what Hofstadter concludes based on the Illuminati, Catholics, and the American right. The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point. Like religious millennialists, he expresses the anxiety of those who are living through the last days, and he is sometimes disposed to set a date for the apocalypse. Religious ideation is entirely appropriate for the paranoid style, consisting as it does in the deployment of symbols and rituals that mediate the unseen world of power. In fact, the more adherents a conspiracy theory attracts, the more it takes on the form of a religion. The first Christians were forced to meet in secret for their communion, which led the Romans to believe that they were eating actual human flesh and drinking actual human blood. Imagine trying to convince a Roman centurion that your house church was not a conspiracy against the Roman Empire and that you were not cannibals. Conspiracy theories increasingly take on the trappings of religion. And some religions can look very much like conspiracies with their special insider knowledge and secret rituals. Related to that and to our series here in the pandemic, Hofstadter notes, but certain religious traditions, certain social structures and national inheritances, certain historical catastrophes or frustrations may be conducive to the release of such psychic energies and to situations in which they can more readily be built into mass movements or political parties. Catastrophe is conducive to the paranoid style. And as we saw last time, the release of psychic energies generates monsters to hold them so that we can read them back. In many ways, the paranoid style belongs to the genre of monster culture. One difference is that it refuses to let the monster die. Finally, Hofstadter concludes his essay with a note of sympathy for the purveyor of the paranoid style. We are all sufferers from history, but the paranoid is a double sufferer, since he is afflicted not only by the real world with the rest of us, but by his fantasies as well. I tend to think that Hofstadter's empathy here is authentic. Regardless, his point is relevant. The world is difficult enough, chaotic, confusing, and no one gets out alive. Why then would we add to our miseries by conjuring stories that further torment us and reinforce our sense of powerlessness? Let us see if we can offer some answers to these questions and others as we seek wisdom in our troubled times. We must keep in mind that Hofstadter's interpretation of the paranoid style comes from the world of November 21st, 1963, pre-Kennedy assassination, pre-moral majority of Jerry Falwell, pre-Fox News, pre-internet. While certain elements of Hofstadter's analysis are dated and context-laden, Others are not, which is what he aspired to in the essay. What I see in Hofstadter is an accurate depiction of the conspiracy theorist in 1963. But in 2020, we are looking at conspiracy theory that has obtained power, something Hofstadter feared but did not experience. This may account for any dissonance you may have felt hearing Hofstadter's analysis, as I did. Conspiracy theories are now viral, and I mean the double entendre. They use existing media forms as hosts in which to breed. This may need to be another lecture entirely, but conspiracists and power brokers use rhetorical forms of argument just to different ends. The seductive power of conspiracy theories is that they exist in a familiar form. They're stories. They come in packaging that is ancient and very efficient. Like other stories, conspiracy stories contain heroes, villains, plots, secrets, even hope sometimes. Some stories entertain, other stories serve as maps. We call these latter stories myths because they orient us in a world that is confusing and hostile. Conspiracy stories are the former seeking to become the latter. Ironically, conspiracists aspire to a mythic status they can never achieve because they are, by definition, marginal perspectives. A conspiracist who convinces everyone that he is right is out of a job. That does not mean, however, that minority opinions are wrong, just that a conspiracist minority depends on a majority that adheres to the mundane story, not the secretly true one. Conspiracy stories exist in opposition to other, more acceptable stories. Without these other stories, there can be no conspiracy. Why then tell the conspiracy story if it cannot exist as myth? Firstly, I doubt that most conspiracists think that far ahead, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way. Just that for these storytellers, immediate concerns are too overwhelming and the future is too uncertain and dangerous. As a holder of many minority opinions, I understand the need for the telling, though. It is the ritual that accompanies the myth, and as a ritual, telling is representing the story in the world instead of letting it fester in your head. To get it out there is to test it. And as we shall see for conspiracy stories, to have it rejected counts as proof of its truth. The power of the kinds of stories that we've been discussing in this series is not always evident, since the deepest and most profound stories exist in the personal and cultural unconscious as a background hum. It takes work in psychology and mythology to surface these stories. Conspiracy stories, however, take that power and put it in our faces, usually with large headlines and several exclamation marks. That sense of foreboding and injustice you feel sometimes, they say, here's what's behind it. Conspiracy theories are stories of desperation. They also use devices and tropes that shoot right past our cognitive defenses and into our limbic fear centers. There is no time for questioning or deliberation because the end of our civilization is near. Marketing does the same thing, by the way, thanks to a man named Edward Bernays, but that is another lecture. While they are stories at heart, conspiracy theories do, however, take on the form of theory. This is the form of story that we respect the most today, since it evokes the authority of science or other kinds of knowing that have been tested and approved and achieved consensus. Conspiracy theories purport to do what theory does, which is etymologically to see, and is related to the word theater. A conspiracy theory is the ultimate big picture, and it promises a broad and deep explanation of a world that is unknown without it. Like theory, conspiracy stories make constellations out of seemingly random star patterns. Like theater, they make the story dramatic and tragic using spectacle. Conspiracy theories are told by and for outsiders. Those who dwell in places of power do not hold conspiracy theories unless they are theories about others on the inside, which would mean, again, that the tellers are outside. As Frank Kermode notes in his brilliant study titled The Genesis of Secrecy, being inside is only a more elaborate way of being outside. A few years ago, I lived in a small apartment complex in another city where we all knew each other in passing, if not closely for some. We had an email chain where we would discuss issues relevant to the complex, the management, rumors of sale of the building, etc. When a new tenant moved in, we welcomed her and put her on the email chain. That is until her child began terrorizing the pets, walking into any open door and even opening closed doors. Casual comments about the problem were met with rebuffs, and the management was too outside for us to consult. So we did the only thing we thought we could. We created a new email chain and left the new tenant out. It was not long before each of us began wondering if there was now another email chain from which we ourselves had been excluded. Such is the nature of secrecy. You always wonder if there's another, deeper secret to which you are not privy. We should note that Kermode's comment comes in a study of the disciples of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. So this phenomenon is not limited to apartment complexes. It is a part of many groups. Being inside is only a more elaborate way of being outside. That is because ultimately there is no inside, no one who has all the secret knowledge. And far from diminishing storytelling, being permanently outside only increases storytelling's frequency and fervor. Kermode's book is a good touchstone for us, dealing as it does with interpretation. And this is what Hofstadter, the historian, would not be inclined to see. And here we enter the world of Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and of many other things like crossroads. It is a fascinating fact that the messenger of the gods is also a trickster. And of course he would be. We access the world through language, but there is a world beyond our words that we cannot reach, though we try with all our ways of knowing. The world outside breaches our linguistic world, though, and requires us to reconstitute it, as is happening now with COVID-19. What we do know of the world is made these days by scientific discourse, both the professional method and the colloquial one. Science means knowledge, and to know means to test and get results that confirm the hypothesis that generated the test. For professional scientists, that process produces laws, like those of gravity and thermodynamics. For colloquial scientists, like the rest of us, testing our hypotheses tells us that it is not good to try to go from Pasadena to Santa Monica in the morning or evening, or perhaps at all. I am being a scientist when I look for proof that she loves me, though be careful with that one. I'm being a scientist when I do my work and get feedback on it with a raise or a demotion. With enough of us doing enough of these tests, we collectively come to some conclusions and a consensus, and we call that the truth. It is a protean truth, but a truth nonetheless, socially constructed out of our many and varied experiences here in the world of becoming. The messenger of the gods, however, is a trickster. To believe in God-eyed views of the world is to be tricked, because we do not see with God's eyes. We live in the dust, are made of it, and will soon return to it. The world is always changing, and so are we. So are all of our conclusions. They're tentative, and our consensus is momentary and fragile. Put another way, to be inside is only a more elaborate way of being outside. I have new experiences that our consensus cannot account for satisfactorily, and sometimes that phenomenon happens on a global scale. A novel virus enters the world and affects us all, and our consensus is broken and must be rebuilt. Stories change, new stories emerge, truth falters, and monsters appear to warn us that change is here. We must begin again to make the world in our words. Hermes laughs and then speeds back to Olympus. What we must do is interpret, and that art is called Hermeneutics, after the trickster god of the same name, and because messages from the gods are never clear. Just ask our old friend Job. Interpretation means simply understanding the meaning of the object of interpretation, but the process is anything but simple. It begins with a plethora of stimuli, events, words, signs, and images that bombard us regularly, and now more than ever, with the advent of our information technology and devices. Some of these stimuli are natural, most are cultural, but all demand interpretation of some kind. Without a story to hold them, our sense data would be a sea of unconnected and meaningless signs, which is something like what psychologists say infants experience. Not surprisingly, we have the same experience in cultural infancy. Creation mythology begins with such undifferentiated and thus uninterpreted and uninterpretable material. Genesis, now the earth was formless and empty darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The Popol Vuh, the council book from Mayan culture. Now it still ripples, now it still murmurs, ripples, it still sighs, it still hums, and it is empty under the sky. The Mesopotamian epic, Enuma Elish, when on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Absu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. The Hindu Rig Veda. Then even nothingness was not, nor existence. There was no air then, nor the heavens beyond it. What covered it? Where was it? In whose keeping? I could go on, but let us let the Dialogic have the final word. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Our beginnings imagine a world that requires no interpretation because there's nothing in it. With creation comes interpretation, hermeneutics. This means that, and that is related to this in that way, etc. Compare those beginnings to the present, where we are overwhelmed by signs demanding our interpretation and over-interpreting each sign. The creation stories can almost be seen as an original quiet in a world that would become too full of signals, too many to read. I seem to keep returning to the Genesis myth for examples, and that is appropriate as it remains a root metaphor of Western culture. Hermes, the trickster, is there in the form of a serpent. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die." "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The serpent, as the first conspiracy theorist, did God really say? Maybe. Like all conspiracy theorists, he was both right and wrong in important ways. "You will not certainly die," he tells the woman, but they most certainly did die. As Hofstadter noted, there's enough truth in a conspiracy theory to make it palatable and enough of a lie to make it dangerous. The serpent's truth points to another aspect of conspiracy theories that give them traction. There are conspiracies. They do exist. People in power hide their malevolence, and when threatened with exposure, attempt to deride and destroy those telling the story. The difference between a truth teller and a conspiracy theorist is motivation and evaluation, which gets at the very issues we have been examining in this series. What is true and how do we know? What do we want from our stories? Do we want to maintain the status quo or expose and demolish the status quo? More to the point for 2020, do we want to be known as a teller, influencer, provocateur, as a performative act? Or do we want to get at a truth using the methods of mundane, consensus-building methodologies that are slower, less dramatic, and will not fit into a cable news segment or a tweet? There are more options than these, of course, but the issue is faith, good or bad. Acting in good faith means openness to learning. Acting in bad faith means using the forms of learning to promote a conclusion already determined and unwaverable. A case in point. Earlier, I mentioned a conspiracy theory in the making, at least, regarding Osama bin Laden and Manly P. Hall, the founder of PRS. This one comes from Louis Sahagan's biography of Mr. Hall, titled Master of the Mysteries. In the preface to the 2016 edition, Sahagan writes this: "Since this book was first published, it was revealed that Al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden was fascinated by Hall's writings. U.S. military officials later suggested that finding Hall's seminal book at bin Laden's hideout was evidence of the Al-Qaeda leader's fascination with the symbolism of secret societies and conspiracies, including the Illuminati and Freemasons." The Illuminati again. You can see the constellation beginning to be drawn here, and Sahagan leaves it to his readers to complete the picture. Two figures as radically different as OBL and MPH, connected by some deeper and necessarily darker thread? Fascinating, right? Only in the paranoid style, I'm afraid, but demonstrating that takes plotting and tedious analysis using a consensus-building approach to truth called scholarship. Such work has been done, I'm happy to say, by scholar Stefano Bigliardi in an article published in the Journal of Religious History titled "What Osama bin Laden Did Not Want to Know, Manly Palmer Hall, Islam, and Conspiracism." This article will not be read as much as Sahagan's Hollywood tale, but for truth seekers, it is the place to go. Here's a portion of the abstract that marks the methodology. Drawing upon scholarly discussions of conspiracism, as well as on examination of bin Laden's figure and messages, this article assesses whether Hall can be described as a conspiracist author, and whether his interpretation of history and Islam could have fascinated the founder of Al-Qaeda. Notice Bigliardi foregrounding his method, which speaks to a good faith attempt to understand the issue, as well as openness to contrasting opinions through the peer review process of a scholarly journal. What does Bigliardi observe? Quote, "One should note here that in fact the US government does not give the editorial details for the English language books, and that according to a BBC article, they were all digital copies rather than printed editions." Well, that's no fun, but at least it's true. Contrast Sahagan's conspiratorial conjuring. It is easy to imagine tall, gray-bearded bin Laden sitting alone in isolation with Hall's book opened to the chapter titled The Faith of Islam. As with all conspiracy theories, this is indeed too easy to imagine. Our own lecturer in residence, Mitch Horowitz, bursts this bubble in an article in Salon.com. Fans of Manly P. Hall are not foil hat-wearing conspiracy mongers who belong in a book club with the 21st century's most notorious terrorist. They are, in many cases, passionate seekers, something bin Laden was not. So Sahagan is selling and telling a story, not seeking truth, as Bigliardi is. One story is more compelling than the other, but only on the surface and only for those seeking spectacle. Spectacle is much easier than scholarship, but scholarship has its own rewards, as Mr. Hall knew. Bigliardi introduces his readers to contemporary scholarship on conspiracies through Michael Barkun's 2013 work, A Culture of Conspiracy, Apocalyptic Visions in Contemporary America. Barkun delineates three assumptions that drive the conspiracy theory mindset. Nothing happens by accident. Nothing is as it seems. Everything is connected. Further, Barkun helpfully puts conspiracist thinking on a spectrum. There are event-related conspiracist theories, the Kennedy assassination, COVID-19, etc. Systemic theories, it's the Jews, the Masons, or the Catholic Church, etc. And then super conspiracy theories like the New World Order, where you could be a part of the conspiracy and not even know it, it's so large. While these categorizations are helpful, Barkun is best in describing the fatal flaw of conspiracy theories. That is, they rely on the rhetoric of knowing, but refuse to allow the theories to be falsified through testing. Conspiracist reasoning runs in the following way. Because conspiracy is so powerful, it controls virtually all the channels through which information is disseminated, universities, media, and so forth. Further, the conspiracy desires at all costs to conceal its activities. So it will use its control over knowledge production and dissemination to mislead those who seek to expose it. Hence, information that appears to put a conspiracy theory in doubt must have been planted by the conspirators themselves in order to mislead. The result is a closed system of ideas about a plot that is believed not only to be responsible for creating a wide range of evils, but also to be so clever at covering its tracks that it can manufacture the evidence adduced by the skeptics. In the end, the theory becomes non-falsifiable because every attempt at falsification is dismissed as a ruse. Here we can see again Hofstadter's point about the conspiracist as double sufferer of both the conspiracy he imagines and the actual world that is already chaotic and brutal enough. So what do we do with these fantastical stories that are non-falsifiable but also compelling? We do what we always do as seekers. We learn from them about ourselves, our stories, and how they work to make or unmake meaning. To do that, let us move from Osama bin Laden's hideout to a summer classroom on 17th century religious poetry. This anecdote comes from literary and legal scholar Stanley Fish's book, Is There a Text in This Class? Fish notes that he was teaching two classes one summer, a linguistics class that met first, followed by the poetry class. As he ends the linguistics class, he writes a reading assignment on the board as follows: Jacobs Rosenbaum, Levin, Thorn, Hayes, and Oman. Fish tells us that he could not remember whether Richard Oman has one N or two. Linguists will recognize these names as scholars in the field. The class leaves, then Fish encloses that list in a box and adds the page 43 notation. After the religious poetry class arrives, he tells them that he has obtained an advance copy of a new book on 17th century religious poetry, and it contains some newly discovered poems, and here is one of them. Now, remember that Fish is lying. This is a linguistics assignment from the previous class. By telling his class that it is a new poem, like the ones they have been studying, he instills a belief in them that determines their interpretation. Having done that, here is what they saw. Fish notes, the first student to speak pointed out that the poem was probably a hieroglyph, although he was not sure whether it was in the shape of a cross or an altar. The first line of the poem received the most attention. Jacob's was explicated as a reference to Jacob's ladder, traditionally allegorized as a figure for the Christian ascent into heaven. In this poem, the means of ascent is not a ladder, but a tree, a rose tree, or Rosenbaum. This was seen to be an obvious reference to the Virgin Mary, who is often characterized as a rose without thorns, itself an emblem of the Immaculate Conception. It at once posed the question, how is it that a man can climb to heaven by means of a rose tree? And directed the reader to the inevitable answer, by the fruit of that tree, the fruit of Mary's womb, Jesus. Once this interpretation was established, it received support from and conferred significance on the word thorn, which could only be an allusion to the crown of thorns, a symbol of the trials suffered by Jesus and of the price he paid to save us all. It was only a short step from this insight to the recognition of Levin as a double reference. First, to the tribe of Levi, whose priestly function Christ was the fulfillment of, and second, to the unleavened bread carried by the children of Israel on their exodus from Egypt, the place of sin, and in response to the call of Moses, perhaps the most familiar of the Old Testament types of Christ. The final word of the poem was given at least 3 complementary readings. It could be omen, especially since so much of the poem is concerned with foreshadowing and prophecy. It could be, oh, man, since it is man's story as it intersects with the divine plan, and that is the poem's subject. And it could, of course, simply be Amen, the proper conclusion to a poem celebrating the love and mercy shown by a God who gave his only begotten Son so that we may live. What do we make of this example? Much, I believe. First of all, it is designed to dispel the notion that meaning lives in a text itself. Rather, meaning is made by what Fish calls an interpretive community, a group that holds pre-existing beliefs. We believe and then see, not see and believe. If we believe we are looking at a religious poem, we will see a religious poem and interpret it accordingly. If we are told it is a linguistics reading list, then we will see that and act accordingly. By now, you may be thinking that this is an example of the paranoid style at work. The sheeple see what they are told to see and do not question it. Those empowered tell some of us to see a linguistics assignment and others to see a poem, and we oblige without question, we sheeple. It could be a perfect example of the naivete of those of us who do not see the conspiracy. If we look more closely at this example, however, it tells us exactly the opposite. While Fish's story of two meanings, one text, is illustrative, and I've used it often throughout my teaching career to illustrate the power of belief in interpretation, there's something missing, and that is the larger story, the one that encompasses them both. Well, in that sense, everything is missing. There's always a story behind the story, a story within the story, and a story in relation to another story. We do believe and then see, if only because our deepest stories tell us what the world is made of. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. We believe the story and thus see the light. There are, however, other stories. I gave you some examples earlier from Hindu, Mayan, and other sources. There are also stories within the stories themselves. For example, the Genesis quotation I used comes from the Genesis creation myth, a single story used in churches and temples and other storytelling venues. A closer look, however, reveals that there are two Genesis stories. One in chapter 1 that comes from one historical and cultural context, another in chapters 2 through 3 that come from a different context and takes a different form. The first story is highly literate, full of lists. The second one is much earlier and closer to orality and the storytelling form we find there. Also, it doesn't take much analysis to see that the order of creation is very different in the two stories. We just have to be alert for difference, not blindly looking for similarity. Had we time to delve into the literary theory of Mikhail Bakhtin, we would see that this multiplicity of voices goes all the way down to the level of the word. Bakhtin argues that every word tastes of the contexts in which it is lived. The point I want to make here in relation to conspiracy stories is that there's always another story. In fact, there's always a larger story containing the two stories. In Fish's example, he keeps the two interpretations separate for the sake of his point, which is that belief drives interpretation. These two stories of interpretation, however, come to us not separately, but in Fish's single story in that story called his book, Is There a Text in This Class? As in Genesis, two separate stories are conflated into one, which makes for three. There's a story behind Fish's story too. And as Fish himself notes, the purpose of a good education is to show you that there are three sides to a two-sided story. Stories never exist alone. They are always in relation in time and space to each other and to us. All we have to do to see this is to imagine Fish's students from one class accidentally meeting students from the other. A third story would emerge then, one of trickery and hermeneutics. Stories never exist in isolation, and they never stand still. They're always in dialogue with one another. Attempts to isolate them make them monologic and impenetrable to critique. Recognition of their relation to other stories makes them dialogic and open to interpretation. Consequently, the tellers of the monologic story are by definition inside of that story and hold a special place of knowledge, if not power, at the very least knowledge of a secret power. The tellers of a dialogic story put themselves into relation and recognize the limitations of their stories as their beauty and strength. This is the difference that Hofstadter and Barkun are getting at with conspiracy stories. They're monologic and shut off from dialogue, from any other interpretations, from falsifiability itself. Mythology, however, is inherently dialogic, recognizing the ephemeral nature of particular stories as tellings for a certain place and time. A conspiracy story shuts out dialogue, and that is its fatal flaw. It claims it is the only true story, like some religions. There's a story about stories that I often tell, and it is a good time to tell it again. This is a true story found in Charles Eastman's book, The Soul of the Indian, involving a missionary who comes to the Seneca tribe with the one true story of Genesis and the Gospels of Christ and salvation. After hearing the story of Christ, the Seneca respond with a story about the origin of corn. The missionary is livid and declares that he's given them the truth, and they have responded with mere fable and falsehood. The Seneca are genuinely confused, existing as they do in a culture of mythology where the more stories there are, the better. And they say to the missionary, "We believed your story, why won't you believe ours?" To give that response with all sincerity is to recognize that there's no one story, that stories being told and tested against one another is the way to wisdom, and that storytelling, therefore, never ends. Thank you for your attention. Be well.